that on? That's me. All right, good morning to you all, and thank you very much for asking me to present this morning. And this is my third Deaf Express, and I see the size of the group getting larger and larger each time. It's a great event. For those who don't know, I've spent most of my working life in deaf education, starting in 1978. Sounds very old, doesn't it? Just so that you do know, I was a unit teacher of deaf children, a visiting teacher, education audiologist, principal of the Cottesloe School, and then executive principal of Wade. And I also was a lecturer with Newcastle Uni for 3 years after that. But, and at the moment, I'm on the board of management for the WA Foundation for Deaf Children, and I'm also part of the History and Heritage Group, which I'll come to in a moment. And I'll just move that on. What I'm going to hopefully do today, my slides changed, but never mind. I did format that correctly, but it mustn't like the computer. It's just my experience since 1978, what's happened in deaf education, and by heck, we went through a lot of change, and I'm sure people are still going through it. Personally though, the biggest change for me was, you'll see me in the back left-hand corner, left-hand corner, you'll notice I've got hair. That's what happens after 40 years of change, all right? You lose your hair, so be warned. That was my first class after I trained in Sydney. Anyway, being a bit more serious, that's what I'd like to cover today, and I will be very brief about the changes. They're the 6 major changes that I've been associated with. That's the shift to inclusive schooling from the Schools for the Deaf, the new technology, both for the diagnosis and also the equipment that the children were wearing, a new focus on the teaching of speech, and those that went through that period will know what I mean. And the 5th thing is the establishment of support roles besides teachers and teachers of the deaf, and also a new on-site Teacher of the Deaf program here in Perth. So, if I start with Schools of the Deaf, and like I said, I'll be very brief and try and touch on the things that have something to do with change. And definitely at the beginning, Schools for the Deaf, we had units, etc. And then as time went on, there was a definite shift away from Schools for the Deaf, and this occurred right around the world, not just only here. And some countries still have their Schools for the Deaf, but not many. And it's important to remember that if you were born around the 1900s and you had a significant hearing loss, the only place for you to go was to a residential deaf school. And of course, we have the one down in Cottesloe. In 1996, would you believe, we had a centenary for the foundation, but initially that was the School for the Deaf. And when you look at it and add on 22 more years, deaf education's been very strong in this state for 122 years. It's a long time. However, as a consequence from the change for Schools for the Deaf, our education facilities changed dramatically from the year 2000. We had Cottesloe. Have I jumped one there? Perhaps I have. Anyway, first of all, Cottesloe closed at 2003, and then we had our secondary units. They closed just before that. At Swanbourne, we had 3 there, I think, and of course Shenton College opened a year later in 2001. And also we had the Mosman Park School for the Deaf, and that's one of the last photos taken on site. They amalgamated, they were recited with the Mosman Park Primary School. So they were significant changes all within a few years. And then we also had classroom units, and this was set up mainly for profoundly deaf students. The partially deaf, they remained at Cottesloe for the time. But if I can go back to that photo that I showed you, where I had hair, that's when we made the move to units, hopefully trying to stimulate some integration or inclusion. That, of course, has long gone now, mainly because the visiting teacher service for the deaf has increased and improved. And the other thing related to the closure of the schools for the deaf was the accommodation, the hostel. And may I add that the WA Foundation for Deaf Children, at its peak, had 130 students boarding full-time down at the Cottesloe site. Now that's a lot. However, from the late 1990s to 2001, we had about 5 or 6. So it was time, the writing was on the wall. And look, it was because the visiting teacher of the deaf service had been extended to the country areas. And I've just got a shot here. It's handy being in the history group because you can draw on some photos. That's the main dining room of the hostel in its early days, and the one on your right just before it closed. But you can still see it's very similar, and with the servery and everything there. So it closed in 2001, and look, I'll just read out some of the places where the visiting teacher of the deaf service extended to: Broome, Kununurra, Port Hedland, Geraldton, Kalgoorlie, Albany, Esperance, Bunbury, Karratha, Manjimup, Paraburdoo and Northam. And I'm sure there's others that I've forgotten about. So that changed the schools for the deaf to a more inclusive working environment, or a classroom environment for the students, which I think was great. But it had its problems, etc., but I'm sure it's worked out well. Now, one of the first things that I did in 1993, I became the principal of, it was called the Hearing Assessment Centre at the time, and later become the WA Institute for Deaf Education. Earlier on, you would probably say it was the WA School for the Deaf because we're on their site. Anyway, the first thing that we looked at was we had 2 teacher aides for all the students in the entire state. I don't know whether people realise that. And it was for 4 students whom we couldn't get the visiting teacher of the deaf service to. So we had 2 teacher aides, as they were called then, education assistants. Now, and when I left deaf education, we had in excess of 400, and that includes the interpreters. So the thing that was needed, because we shifted from signed English, which was invented by teachers, over to Auslan, which is, definitely the language of the deaf. So we switched to that for all our programs. But of course, as more and more of the students who signed wanted to go into regular school, we needed educational interpreters. Now that was a long slog, but it was a change that we all had to go through. It was a huge change for the education department at the time. And we started in 1994, and I think around 1997 was the year we put in I don't know how many applications, because look, it was quite significant. It was a huge change in educational thinking. And when you think about it, what other student has another adult with them in the room besides the teacher? I can't think of any. And of course, this was huge for the department. And they wanted me to cost a 5-year plan, and I think it was like 1.5 billion, which would probably be 3 times that amount now. And that was too much. They couldn't do it. So they agreed to a pilot. And we did by pinching some teacher aid time from Osmond Park or education assistant time, and they gave us 2 days a week. So we had a full-time trial interpreter. But what really changed it, because we had first of all, we had working parties with the Deaf Society, WA Deaf Society, industrial officers from unions, parents, teachers of the deaf, interpreters, and of course departmental policy officers. But what really changed it was the Disability Discrimination Act. and the department had to agree to it. So, would you believe it wasn't until 2003 that we finally got the classification educational interpreter. So that's only 15 years ago that they actually came out with the classification educational interpreter. Prior to that, when we were trialling it, they were known as education assistants. So it's only 15 years old, but I'm not sure how many interpreters are working now, but when I left there were 54, and of that I think there were 36 that were working one-on-one. So that's 36 full-time adults working out there in the schools, one-on-one, which I think is brilliant. It's a huge change. It was a great change for us, not so for the department because of the costs. But obviously they've got to do something about it. Okay, and then we had note takers, but as I understand it, they had to work under the education assistant banner, and I'm not sure where that's up to now. The next change, of course, was amplification and technology, and with the advent of universal newborn screening, that was another change that impacted hugely on all services for deaf education. Because there were an increasing number of students, they were being diagnosed earlier, which was great, but also the students who had a mild loss or a unilateral hearing loss, they were also diagnosed earlier. And of course that has put extra strains on the services because they do need service, many of them. So, and another significant change, of course, has been the rapid progress with amplification and also with the development of the cochlear implant. Now, when I came into deaf education in 1978, there were still students wearing body hearing aids. So that's not that long ago. And most of the students had what they call a CAL-aid, which was, I think, made under licence for Australian Hearing, which was then the National Acoustic Laboratory, which didn't have many tweaks that you could alter. You know, it was not one size fits all, but just about. However, within a few years of being in deaf education, they were issuing Phonak hearing aids, which had an output of about 135 decibels, which I've been told is like standing at 1 metre away from a jet aircraft engine. That's the level of sound that they do produce. A classroom amplification system is another area that was prominent in the 80s and not so much into the 90s. And I'll just show you. That's called a group amplification system, and the children would sit around that with their headphones on, and the teacher would have a microphone. Now, these were far superior to hearing aids, and that's why we encouraged it. Most of the students didn't like it, of course, and I've got some shots of, that's even at the early intervention level, primary level, and secondary level. And there's various ways of using it, but that was a group aid, but it was a slightly different format. We also had speech training units, known as Alicons, and again, they were superior to hearing aids, and they are superior to a lot of hearing aids even today. They are high fidelity type instruments, very old though. And again, we used them in the early intervention centre. We also used it in the sign language early intervention program. And I'm hoping that one day in the future that perhaps there are modern ones available which are superior to hearing aids, that we may see them return, because you do have much control over who's speaking by moving the microphone, all those sorts of activities you can do. Anyway, the other thing was FM systems. When I came into deaf education, they were coming in 1978, and you were pretty lucky to get an FM system back in the late 70s, early 80s. So that was a huge change again for us. And the students had to get used to handing the microphone to the teachers, and they had to get used to wearing a big heavy piece of amplification that was connected to their hearing aids. because we couldn't get enough of it, we designed our own. We went to Tandy's, which is now Dick Smith, which is closed, I know. But I happened to have a photo that the Education Department wanted to take, and using Velcro and just ordinary earphones that you plug in your ear that you use today, we cut those off because we were after the magnet inside. We attached it near the magnet of the hearing aid, and that gave the kids a sort of like a homemade FM system, but it worked. So whilst a lot of them were waiting, we did develop that, and it was myself, but Mavis and Brian Fisher's son Andrew, he was still at high school, so we were, he was soldering things and whatever, but we got the job done. And we also had a cord that you could plug into the TV and into the earphone socket, and they had a crystal clear sound going in. Whether they heard it or not's another thing, but it was a big improvement, for about $20. And that's the change that I was associated with. And of course, that's the Velcro. We love Velcro, don't we? I use it for lots of things. And then, of course, the telecommunication system, TTY, that was fantastic for the deaf. And there were portable ones, there were ones you could fit in your top pocket and so on, but they didn't last long because along came the smartphone. But this was during my time, and it was. And I know we had to take calls to deaf parents and to some of the older students on the TTY, and you'd need sometimes up to half an hour because you'd type something and then you'd type in GA, that means go ahead, then they'd type it back, and it'd be sort of one letter at a time coming through. But at the time, it was brilliant. We could communicate with anybody, and the deaf could communicate with anybody. After that, the next move in technology was the cochlear implant. And for those who don't know, how am I going for time? Still a few more minutes? I'll try and speed it up. The first cochlear implant for a child fitted in this state was 1985, and photo here. I must have went backwards. No, here we go. And it was a one channel, not this particular one, but prior to that, a couple of years prior to that, it was a single channel. Then it developed into multi-channel. 22, I think, were in the array. And then, obviously, they had the behind-the-ear one. That didn't come in until 1998. So prior to that, they all had to wear a box down here. And the problem for us was that only 3 in Western Australia could be fitted with a cochlear implant per year, unless you had a lot of money and could go off and do it yourself. The next thing was speech teaching. And look, this was huge. Prior to this, people, teachers of the deaf, speech pathologists, etc., they would look at, for oral language, they would look at the mirror to correct sounds. They would work on correctly pronouncing consonants, correctly pronouncing vowels, and so on. But this gentleman, Dr. Dan Ling, came along, and it swept right throughout deaf education because his belief was that all speech correction must go through the student's ears. In other words, use their residual hearing, because every deaf person has some residual hearing. And with the advent of better hearing aids and cochlear implants, it worked well. And we were lucky to have him out here several times. But the Green Book is the Green Book that we all carried around and we underlined and we tried to make sense of. But we really should have had, a year's course on it. Anyway, moving on, names changed as well during my time. We changed from deaf and hearing impaired, partial hearing impaired, we changed to deaf and hard of hearing. And this was a global thing as well. Hearing Assessment Centre, as I said, went to the WA Institute for Deaf Education. And of course, the WA School for Deaf changed to the Foundation. And throughout the history and during that time, we've been strongly supported by the Foundation, which gave us a distinct advantage over other states. They supported us with cars, which meant that places like Geraldton, teachers could visit students double the visits they were originally getting. And the Foundation also paid for professional learning, I almost said professional development, professional learning of parents, education assistants, interpreters and teachers of the deaf. But one of the significant changes for us was that the University of Melbourne came on site in 1996 for 2 years to train teachers to become teachers of the deaf. And they left in 2007, so that's not too bad, is it? We had them there for quite some time, and after that we had the University of Newcastle. I'll try and speed this up a little bit. What it gave us anyhow, and that's what I wanted to say, we were the only state in the whole of Australia to have fully qualified teachers of the deaf in every single position. The only state, and that was because of the Foundation and the University of Melbourne. With parents, that's an interesting one, because prior to coming into deaf education, it was called parent guidance, and that meant in the home. But that, with numbers, obviously you had to change, and we had our parent guidance centre, then we had the parent infant centre, and then it became the early intervention centre, plus the early intervention sign language program. I should move on. That's the parents. And look, just to finish, I wanted to say that one of the things that was most misunderstood the whole time I was around, and we had to try and change, was the actual role of the teacher of the deaf. People, even schools, principals, they all misunderstood what the role was. They thought teachers of the deaf were there to support the students, to help them with their maths. Or to help with reading. But it's a lot more than that. And look, I've got a fairly complicated diagram, but this actually got reproduced in the British Association of Teachers of the Deaf journal. It's a model that says all the things we do as a teacher of the deaf. Now, there's a lot of things there, but the number one thing was about communication, giving them communication competence. And all these other things tie in with that. And I won't go into that now, but the model, that made it clear. People would say, even at central office, what do those teachers of the deaf do? What makes them different? I would hand them that and give them a little 5-minute spiel, and it would help. But that was the change. Rather than just being teachers of the deaf, this was what went with a teacher of the deaf. This was what we could do. And to finish with, another change that came to deaf education was that we got our museum going and our history, and we need to do that because it goes back to 1896. And we do have a website, which is the right-hand column there. I'll show you the address in a second. But we also have the book by the late Dr. Harry Blackmore, which covers everything till 1996. So I think it's about time we had volume 2 from 1997 onwards. But I do commend both of those places to you, if the book and the site, if you want to learn a bit about the history and the changes that we actually did go through. And I'm sure all the changes we have gone through are for the better and will keep on changing. So thank you.